As Napoleon was borne southwards by his British captors, he had plenty of time to take stock of the motley crew of adventurers who had chosen to accompany him and who would form his tiny court on the distant island of St. Helena. Only 3 of the 15 officers who were with him on the Bellerophon were allowed to transfer to the Northumberland, and Generals Savary and Lallement had been expressly excluded as being on the Bourbon government's most wanted list. First in rank was General Comte Henry Gratian Bertrand, an aide since 1807 and successor to Duroc as Grand Marshal of the Palace. 4 years younger than the Emperor, Bertrand had served him faithfully, but relations between the two were poor, mainly because of the behavior of Bertrand's problem wife, Fanny, an unregenerate royalist, who frequently angered Napoleon by her unpunctuality and lack of deference. Fanny showed her true caliber by throwing an hysterical fit and trying to hurl herself from a cabin window on the Bellerophon when her husband announced he would be sharing the emperor's exile. General Baron Gaspard Gourgaud, age 32, the first orderly officer, was always Napoleon's favorite of the St. Helena entourage, but the obstinate and unbalanced Gourgaud remains an enigma to this day. Some say he was a Judas, others that he was merely the St. Peter who temporarily denied his master. He had not originally been on the St. Helena shortlist, but when he threw a scene of hysterical jealousy, a complacent emperor allowed him to be substituted for the original choice, Colonel Planat. As Chamberlain there was appointed Comte Emmanuel Joseph de Las Cases, a civilian nobleman, formerly Chamberlain and Maître des Requêtes in the Council of State, who was accompanied to St. Helena by his young son, Emmanuel. Las Cases scarcely knew Napoleon, but he was to develop a close friendship with the exiled emperor. The most controversial appointment, and in many ways the key to the entire St. Helena episode, was a relative unknown who had wormed his way into the emperor's good graces during the 100 Days. The 33-year-old Marquis Charles Tristan de Montholon was always an unlikely Bonapartist. So far from being a distinguished soldier, he was a coward who habitually shirked military service under the pretext of various illnesses and managed to avoid the sound of gunfire entirely during the 100 Days. But Montholon had an attractive wife who was quite willing to live on St. Helena, and that may have been the main reason Napoleon chose him. He was not a man to live for long periods without female company, and at Malmaison he had already turned down the offer by the gallant and loyal Marie Walewska to share his fortunes wherever he went. Napoleon also had permission to take 12 servants with him to the South Atlantic. As chief valet he chose a young man named Louis Marchand, just 24, who turned out to be discreet, adroit, shrewd and observant, a kindly soul, gifted with abundant common sense and refined feelings, loyal, devoted, modest and disinterested. Marchand was the living refutation of the old saw that no man is a hero to his valet. He idolized the emperor. His assistant Saint Denis was a kind of lesser Marchand. Cipriani the butler was another who won golden opinions from Napoleon. Another valet, the Switzer named Novaraz, Santini, factotum and keeper of the purse, Ali a Mameluke bodyguard, 3 footmen, a pantryman, a cook and a iambman completed the complement of Bonaparte's retainers. A further addition to the emperor's personal staff was Dr. Barry O'Meara, a ship's surgeon on the Bellerophon, who was appointed the emperor's physician when Dr. Mangault refused to accompany Napoleon to St. Helena. O'Meara was given permission by the Admiralty to take the position provided he acted as a spy within the imperial household. But it appears that O'Meara soon went native. He became a double agent at best, but the intelligence he provided the British was worthless and the advice he gave Napoleon was good. Out of the 16 souls accredited to Bonaparte's court in St. Helena, no less than 7 left memoirs of varying worth. Since British official records draw heavily on what was told to the governor of St. Helena by these eyewitnesses, the unenviable task for any historian of Napoleon on St. Helena is to make sense of their conflicting accounts. The Northumberland slowly made its way south on the great Atlantic swells. Napoleon's usual luck aboard ship held, for there were no storms in the expected latitudes, and the voyage was uneventful. The ship was off Funchal on the 24th of August, and 3 days later Gomera and the Canaries was sighted. Napoleon spent most of his time playing vingt-et-un with his courtiers, or whist with the British officers, but liked to be sociable and on the 12th of September took part in landing a shark from the ocean. Admiral Cockburn, who bridled at the emperor's habit of leaving the dinner table as soon as he had bolted his food, nevertheless conceded that he was a great favorite with all ranks and had descended from the emperor to the general with a flexibility of mind more easily to be imagined than described, doubtless thinking this would seem to his superiors in the Admiralty, as though he had fallen under the Bonaparte spell. He laced his reports with uncomplimentary remarks about the ogre's intellect and intelligence. Colonel Bingham wrote that General Bonaparte asked questions which revealed a depth of ignorance a cultivated Englishman would have blushed to admit to, while Cockburn himself added that Napoleon's ignorance was so prodigious that it took a kind of perverted genius to remain so intellectually benighted. Another focus for deprecatory remarks was the emperor's linguistic talent. and his inability to learn English. He was on board 6 weeks and at the end could not even pronounce our names correctly. The Northumberland crossed the equator at longitude 3°36 on the 23rd of September and on the 16th of October anchored at St. Helena, a bastion of black basalt, all that remained of an extinct volcano, used as a watering place by ships of the East India Company, and a base from which to dominate the South Atlantic by the Royal Navy. The island boasted a mixture of inhabitants from all the races of the earth: Europeans, blacks, Malays, Indians, Chinese. Its society was dominated, if not governed, by an aristocracy composed of high officials from John Company and great landowners whose estates were still worked by slaves. To keep Napoleon there, the British government had earmarked Zido soldiers, 500 guns and 2 brigs on constant patrol around the rocky coast. The total cost of maintaining the covering squadron and the near 3,000 military and civilians on the island was estimated at £400,000 a year. Napoleon was cast down by his first sight of the volcanic island, just 28 miles in circumference, and apparently as escape-proof as Devil's Island. He is said to have remarked that he would have done better to stay in Egypt in 1799. His first night on the island was spent in a boarding house in the port of Jamestown. The East India Company had retained all the best houses when they handed St. Helena over to the British government, so there was a dire shortage of suitable accommodation. Accordingly, for 2 months the Emperor lived in a pavilion in the Garden of the Briars, where resided William Balcombe, the East India Company agent. At the Briars, Napoleon amused himself by a bizarre, half-flirtatious, half-facetious teasing of the 2 Balcombe daughters, Jane, 16, and Betsy, 14. Betsy was a particular favorite, for with the lack of self-consciousness of youth, she treated Napoleon as an equal in hoydenish practical jokes and pointed out loudly, with the innocence of adolescence, that the Emperor cheated at cards. It was a sad moment for Napoleon when the Balcombes returned to England in 1818, by which time Betsy had emerged from the tomboy chrysalis into the butterfly colors of a pretty young woman. She was always very fond of Napoleon, remembered him with great affection and, many years later, recalled these times in conversation with Louis Napoleon, who rewarded her with an estate in Algeria. In December, Napoleon moved to Longwood, formerly the summer seat of the lieutenant governor, but really little more than a very large bungalow. Although it was said to contain 44 rooms, many of them were no bigger than cramped cells or outhouses, and the sheer physical proximity of so many people produced its own problems. For his own use, Napoleon reserved a study, drawing room, an antechamber with a billiard room, a crepuscular dining room, a bedroom and a bathroom. On a plateau at 700 feet, Longwood was supposed to have a healthier climate than Jamestown, 5 miles away. But St. Helena was in general an unhealthy spot, where amoebic dysentery, caught from a parasite, was an endemic problem. No less than 56 men out of in the ZND battalion of the 66th Regiment, doing garrison duty on the island, succumbed to it in these years. Everyone in the Bonaparte household except Bertrand caught the disease at one time or another. The problem was augmented by lack of sanitation, and all fresh water had to be brought to Longwood from a well 3 miles away. The other notorious problem with Longwood was that it was infested with rats, which were so bold that they would even run between the legs of diners when they were at table. Nevertheless, Napoleon made the best of an unpromising situation, and went riding over a 12-mile area without supervision. Bertrand issued dozens of passes for visitors, and there were frequent excursions with friends like the Balcombes or Dr. Warden, the surgeon from the Northumberland. Napoleon continued to learn English from lost cases, though he was an atrocious linguist, as the following attempt, dated the 7th of March 1816 shows. Count Lascauses, since 6th week, why learn the English and why do not any progress? 6th week do 40 in 2 day. If might have learned 50 word, for day, I could gnome at 2,200. Soon he decided to cut his losses, and after October 1816 there were no more English lessons, although the Emperor would sometimes snub Admiral Cockburn, just to make clear their respective stations. The rapport built up over the 2 months at sea saw them through temporary difficulties, but the halcyon days came to an end on the 14th of April 1816 with the arrival as governor of Sir Hudson Lowe, a creature of Lord Bathurst's, who brought new instructions concerning General Bonaparte's enforced stay on the island. A career officer without private means, and with the crippling legacy of an unhappy childhood, Lowe was a narrow, humorless, by-the-book martinet, who lacked the social ease and innate confidence to make a success of a job calling for self-reliance, and the broadest human sympathies. No more disastrous choice as Napoleon's jailer can be imagined, and his appointment prompts obvious questions about the British government's motivation. It has been suggested that London declined to appoint an aristocrat or true grandee to the post, as such men were susceptible to charm and thus liable to be won over by Bonaparte's charisma. Others speculate that because Lowe for many years commanded the Corsican Rangers, and spoke Italian, he was thought suitable, but, if we take this seriously, it bespeaks staggering ineptitude in London. The Corsican Rangers Rangers were Corsican exiles, deserters and royalist emigrants who hated Napoleon. The commander of such men was no more likely to commend himself to Napoleon than the Comte d'Artois Robespierre. 2 days after arriving, Low tried to see Napoleon, but the emperor was angry with Admiral Cockburn, who had recently insisted that a British officer should accompany General Bonaparte on his rides round Longwood. He therefore declined to see the two men together. On the 17th of April 1816, Low insisted on an interview and arrived at Longwood in company with Cockburn, who was to introduce him to Napoleon in accordance with normal protocol. The ingenuity that had served him through 50 battles had not deserted the emperor. He had the footman show Low into the drawing room, then shut the door in Cockburn's face when he tried to follow. The first interview went well enough, with some inconsequential talk about Corsica and Egypt, where Low had served. Low was pleased with his own performance, and in this mood of initial euphoria invited him to the governor's mansion and put the library at his disposal. But things turned sour, and as it turned out, irretrievably so, at the next meeting at Longwood, on the 30th of April. Emboldened by what he took to be the success of the first meeting, Low got down to business and divulged the new instructions from Bathurst, a man who was as much his alter ego as Neipperg had been Metternich's. These turned out to be draconian in the extreme. Napoleon's household was to be reduced from 15 to 11. Those who elected to remain had to sign a document guaranteeing they would remain indefinitely. The new annual expenditure was limited to £8,000. No correspondence was allowed except through the governor, and only he could issue passes to visit Longwood. No gifts could be delivered to him if they contained any mention of imperial or sovereign status. Riding without limits and without supervision was to be curtailed. The presence of the prisoner at Longwood was to be checked twice daily, and much more in the same vein. The instructions breathed a spirit of pure, vindictive spite, of a peace with the state-sanctioned kidnapping by which the British had brought Napoleon to St. Helena in the first place. One of Napoleon's biographers has commented, "It is impossible for an Englishman to read the Low Bathurst correspondence without blushing for his country." On our 6th May there was a further meeting at Longwood. By this time Napoleon had had time to digest the full implications of Bathurst's instructions, and was very angry. He accused Low of persecuting him and of causing him far more heartache in 1 month than Cockburn in 6. He charged Low with being a little man interested only in the exercise of petty power, and told him that his behavior would become a source of scandal which would besmirch his reputation, that of his children and of England in general. Low stormed out angrily. Napoleon, who had earlier declared in a cri du coeur, "I want my liberty or I want a hangman," now found that his cry had been answered, though hardly in the sense he intended. He told Los Cases, "They've sent me more than a hangman. Sir Low is a hangman." Low's final interview with Napoleon was on R8 August R6. As a witness to the intolerable rudeness he had to put up with, the governor took with him to Longwood Admiral Malcolm, Cockburn's successor as commander of the squadron of frigates on constant patrol around St. Helena. They found Napoleon in the garden in a towering rage. Low started to talk about the necessity of reducing expenditure, but Napoleon, pointedly addressing his remarks to Malcolm, launched into a tirade about the way Low, a commander of cutthroats in the Corsican Rangers, treated a real general like Bertrand. Low tried to cut across by talking of his duty. He claimed he had not sought the job, but said nothing about why he had accepted it, and, while drawing a hefty emolument of PSRZ 0 a year, tried to get the entire Longwood entourage to subsist on 2/3 of that sum. Not surprisingly, Napoleon became agitated and spoke of begging his bread from the British garrison, as one soldier from others. Then he and Low became involved in a heated slanging match about the merits of Lord Bathurst. Finally, the emperor turned on him with withering contempt. "I've never seen you on any battlefield. You were only good for hiring assassins." Once again Low lost his composure and stormed away angrily. Napoleon and Low now settled in for a protracted Cold War, the latter determined to stick to the letter of every nugatory regulation that came from the dreadful Bathurst, the former determined to extract the maximum propaganda advantage from Low's mindless foibles. When, in October 1816, Low informed Montholon that French credit was exhausted in Jamestown, and in future the inhabitants of Longwood would have to pay for their food supplies from their own pockets, the emperor pounced. In a tremendous propaganda coup, Napoleon had his silver plate broken up and sold to a jeweler in Jamestown, raising nearly piche on the first sale and roughly equal sums on 2 subsequent occasions. The jeweler, Gideon Solomon, ostentatiously weighed the silver fragments in a public display witnessed by British officers embarking for England. There was a similar incident involving supplies of wood. Napoleon, with his mania for roaring fires and anyway combating excessive damp at Longwood, complained about the niggardly ration of coal and wood. So as not to be wrong-footed, Low doubled the allowance of coal but stated that he could do nothing to increase the wood ration, as lumber was scarce on the island. Napoleon then had some of his furniture, including a bedstead and some shelves, broken up and used as firewood. He made sure the story lost nothing in the telling in the hostelries of Jamestown. But Low was guilty of his most spectacular idiocy over a marble bust of Napoleon's son secretly sent out to St. Helena. Low got to hear about the clandestine import and impounded it, on the absurd grounds that a marble bust might contain a secret message. O'Meara, in his capacity as double agent, told Low that Napoleon knew about the bust, was angry that it had been kept from him, and intended to turn the affair to propaganda advantage. The wretched Low, fearful that he might have done the wrong thing and be reprimanded by Bathurst, sent the bust up to Longwood, where Napoleon gave it pride of place in his bedroom. The conditions in which Napoleon was held on the island, the decaying state of Longwood, infested with rats and plagued by dysentery, the meanness and petty spite of Low and Bathurst, all these became the subject of a public outcry in England in 1817. Despite all Low's precautions, dozens of messages and bulletins reached the Fox family at Holland House, and the many other powerful Bonaparte supporters in England. In March 1817, articles appeared in the Times, clearly insinuating that the British government was trying to hasten Napoleon to an early death. A censure was moved in the House of Lords, when Lord Holland signally got the better of Bathurst in debate. Although the government easily defeated the motion in the Lords, they were rattled by the adverse publicity. Bathurst was forced to instruct Low that the allowance at Longwood was to be restored to the full £1 2000. Another bone of contention was Low's refusal to address Napoleon as emperor, and his continuing use of the title General Bonaparte, which was calculated to turn the person referred to splenetic. Low invited General Bonaparte to dine at Plantation House and meet the Countess of Loudon, and seemed surprised and put out when he received no reply. Apparently unable to take a hint, he persisted in his asinine conduct with another invitation to the general to attend a party at Plantation House for the Prince Regent's birthday. Napoleon suggested that since recognition of the historical reality that he actually had been an emperor appeared to stick in Low's craw, a solution might be for him to go under an alias. He suggested Colonel Muirin or Baron Duroc, after two of his beloved officers. Low refused, on the grounds that an assumed name was the prerogative only of sovereigns. Evidently in his time with the Corsica Rangers he had never heard of a nom de guerre. When in doubt, Low always did the wrong thing. A Bonaparte admirer tried to get round the problem of nomenclature by inscribing a book to Imperatori Napoleoni, since the Golden Age Latin translation of this would be General Napoleon. Low, however, learned from the pedants on his staff that in Silver Latin this could be translated as Emperor Napoleon and confiscated the book. Such was Low's paranoia that he suspected a code or cipher in the most unlikely places. When Montholon gave the French commissioner, Montchenu, some white and green beans to plant in his garden, Low suspected that the different colors of the beans had a semiotic significance. Even more fatuously, when Napoleon tried to order a new pair of shoes from the cobblers, Low intervened to say that the old pair of shoes had first to be sent to him and he would commission their replacement. From time to time certain English my country right or wrong Bonapartophobes have tried to rehabilitate Low's reputation, and assert that he was simply a rather naive dupe of Napoleon's well-oiled propaganda machine. Unfortunately, this argument falls foul of all the extant independent evidence. When the three Allied commissioners, charged with observing that the treaty relating to Bonaparte was being carried out, arrived on the island, they too found Low a sore trial. The French commissioner, the Marquis de Montchenu, he who had been given the beans by Montholon, found Low constantly trying to censor his small talk and malicious gossip, even the absurd canard he tried to spread that the Emperor and Betsy Balcombe were lovers. The Austrian commissioner Baumain felt that Low treated the Allied observers with scant respect, reported back examples of his egregious rudeness to Vienna, and complained at the paranoid system of espionage with which Low oversaw every trivial detail of life on the island. The Russian commissioner Sturmer was even more forthright. It would be difficult to find a man more awkward, extravagant and despicable. The English fear and avoid him, the French make a mock of him, the commissioners complain of him, and everybody agrees that he is touched in the head. Admiral Malcolm had nothing good to say of a man who became insanely jealous because Napoleon enjoyed good relations with Malcolm and confided in him. Even the Duke of Wellington, who had sacked Low from his staff before Waterloo, recorded that he was a damned fool. The long feud took its toll on both men. Though Low was consistently outwitted and outpointed intellectually, he had the consolations of power, and the solace of a huge salary. Napoleon was dragged down by the intrinsic stress of his impotent position, by the internecine conflict between his courtiers and by the unhealthy climate itself. His dreary life of reading, walking, pottering in the garden, Dictating memoirs and staging dramatic readings from Corneille, Racine and Molière was made more tedious by the foggy, rainy climate of the volcanic island, the decreasing opportunities for physical exercise resulting from Lowe's strictures and the constant threat from amoebic dysentery. Whereas Napoleon's external conflict in these years was with Lowe, his internal battles concerned disease and the prima donnas in his household. Almost from the moment of Lowe's advent, Napoleon was frequently, though intermittently, ill. In May R6 he complained of weakness in his legs, headaches, abnormal sensitivity to light and a feeling of perpetual chill. His courtiers noticed that his speech was slurred. He had a gloomy air and seemed to be drugged. In July he was complaining of a pain in his side like a razor. In September the same year he had a week-long illness, of which the symptoms were insomnia, fever, headaches, colic and bad temper. Then, from October to the 9th of November R6, he had his most serious bout of illness yet, with headaches, swelling of the gums, looseness of the teeth, persistent coughing, shivering fits, trembling sensations, feelings of intense cold and weak and swollen legs. He alternated insomnia at night with drowsiness by day. He told O'Meara he suspected the British of poisoning him. The curious cycle of good health and sudden illness continued throughout 1817. He was ill with the same symptoms in February and March, then had 6 weeks of health, and then relapsed with the same old maladies. 2 months of rude health in July and August were followed by a further valetudinarian period in September. It was remarked that he was frequently thirsty and was forever drinking lemon juice. The intake of vitamin C meant that his symptoms could not have indicated scurvy, with which all his ailments were otherwise compatible. Other medical observers are positive that he suffered from amoebic dysentery, that an abscess formed on his liver, a not uncommon consequence of the disease, and that this drained into the lungs, chest, stomach and peritoneum, causing secondary problems in those areas. This would explain some of the symptoms: shooting pains, coughing, nausea, vomiting, but by no means all of them. Whatever the explanation, after 1817 the emperor's health gradually worsened. For other reasons, too, Longwood was a restless house, the cockpit of bitter intrigues and jealousies among the members of Bonaparte's court. The patient, tireless plotter who took the long view, the Aramis of the peace, was Montholon, but in the early years he bided his time, allowing the mercurial Gurgod the center stage. In the first year of exile on St. Helena, Las Cases was so obviously the emperor's favorite that Gurgod fumed and sulked. There was clearly a homosexual element in Gurgod's feelings for Napoleon, for in his journals he refers to him as she. But Las Cases was arrested by Hudson Lowe in November 1816. When it was discovered that he had smuggled secret correspondence out of the island, deportation swiftly followed. Some observers have suspected Las Cases of setting up his own apprehension, as he was tired of exile. It is certainly striking that he refused to return to Longwood on a promise of good behavior, as offered by Lowe. Las Cases's departure partly answered Lowe's demand for a reduction in the staff at Longwood, but further dismissals were necessitated by Bathurst's imposed quota, and among the first to depart was Santini. On arrival in London, Santini went to Lord Holland and gave him a full picture of life at Longwood, as well as a smuggled copy of Napoleon's Remonstrance, which Holland worked up into a very effective pamphlet entitled Appeal to the English Nation. Napoleon consoled himself, on the departure of his favorite Las Cases, that he too would be effective in the propaganda effort being mounted on his behalf in Europe. With Las Cases gone and Bertrand, to Napoleon's annoyance, spending too much time with his wife and family, Montholon was put in charge of the household. Bertrand felt this an infringement of his prerogatives and brooded, but Gurgod was more of a fighter. By this time it was obvious that Napoleon had made the pert and pretty Albine de Montholon his mistress, with Montholon himself as pander. Scholars have sometimes objected that there is no direct evidence of this liaison, but even if Napoleon was not a compulsive womanizer, and we could in all seriousness imagine him content with a sexless, monastic existence, there is much at Longwood that cannot be explained otherwise. In his diary entry of arrest December R6, Gurgod unwittingly provided clear evidence of the affair, and it was Albine's hold over the emperor that provoked Gurgod to challenge Montholon to a duel. Montholon, a noted physical coward, ducked the challenge but complained to the emperor that Gurgod was unbalanced. He instituted an effective whispering campaign against Gurgod, just as he had done earlier with Las Cases, but showed his moral imbecility by also disparaging the emperor behind his back to Gurgod. By the end of R7, Napoleon had had enough of Gurgod. His followers' easy relations with Hudson Lowe, the constant battling with Montholon and his jealous rages pushed the emperor to snapping point. Gurgod himself records a dressing down he received when his hero accused him of sulking like a woman. Napoleon said if he had known what life at Longwood was going to be like, he would have brought only servants, for talking to a parrot was preferable to dealing with his temperamental courtiers. Poignantly he expressed to Gurgod some of the anguish that usually lay hidden. Don't you think that when I wake in the night I don't have dark moments, when I remember what I was and what I am now? But Gurgod threatened to leave his service once too often, and finally Napoleon took him at his word. Once in London, Gourgaud acted the role of great betrayer. He met Bathurst and the French and Russian ambassadors and popularized 3 blatant lies. He asserted that Napoleon had an immense treasure of gold and silver at Longwood, and could escape from St. Helena whenever he chose. Even worse, although he had himself been ill on the island, he claimed that St. Helena had a healthy climate, and that Napoleon's illnesses were purely diplomatic, an obvious ploy to gain sympathy in Europe. Bathurst pounced on these admissions and used them to persuade the Allies at the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle to confirm the conditions of Napoleon's detention. Although Gourgaud later recanted and wrote high-flown appeals to the Tsar and Marie-Louise to get the emperor released, the damage was done. Not surprisingly, Gourgaud was not mentioned in Napoleon's will. Having seen the back of both lost cases in Gourgaud, Montholon felt confident that there was now no impediment to his dominance at Longwood. Unexpectedly, Napoleon turned to the butler Cipriani as his confidant. Suddenly Cipriani too was gone, dying in agony on the 26th of February R8 from a mysterious and undiagnosed complaint. A few days later, again for reasons unexplained, his body was exhumed and never found again. This is an incident historians have never cleared up satisfactorily, and is especially murky when one considers that Cipriani had served with Hudson Lowe on Capri in R806, but was at the time one of Salisti's double agents. The more one penetrates the arcana of the world of Longwood, the more it appears like one of the darker chapters in Balzac or Alexander Dumas. However, Montholon could never have things entirely his own way at Longwood. The next complication came from Dr. O'Meara. Finding a swelling on the emperor's right side in the region of the liver, O'Meara diagnosed hepatitis and treated him with mercury. But Napoleon, possibly primed by Montholon, suddenly broke off the treatment and accused O'Meara of making reports to Hudson Lowe. This was true enough, but there was increasing concern in the governor's mansion at Plantation House that O'Meara's intelligence did not square with that being passed by Montholon to the French commissioner, Montchenu. Lowe, however, got O'Meara to return to Longwood and give his word of honor that he would make no more reports, while secretly insisting that he do just that. Napoleon, who seems to have been fond of O'Meara, took him back. However, Lowe soon determined to be rid of O'Meara, for 2 reasons. It came to his attention that O'Meara was corresponding directly to the Admiralty, bypassing him, and in Europe the returning Gourgaud alleged that O'Meara was the secret channel by which the emperor communicated with his supporters in Europe. Once again Lowe and Bathurst proved to be men of like mind. Lowe wrote to request O'Meara's dismissal, but Bathurst had always decided independently that he should be removed. O'Meara departed St. Helena on the 25th of July R8, still on cordial terms with Napoleon. Once in England he made public his opinion that the emperor's health was suffering because of the unhealthy climate on St. Helena, and was court-martialed and dismissed from the navy for his pains. It is difficult to feel much sympathy for O'Meara, who seems to have been a likable rogue. Without telling Napoleon, he passed on the gossip of Longwood to the Admiralty, who in turn circulated it to the Prince Regent and his rakish circle. Meanwhile he accepted money from Napoleon without telling Lowe or the Admiralty. Even his skills as a doctor are open to question. Some allege that Napoleon's robust health during the second half of 1818 was attributable to his no longer ingesting the mercury in calomel prescribed by his Irish quack. By 1818, fortified by the endorsement of the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle for the terms of General Bonaparte's detention, and tired of the remorseless bad publicity he was receiving, Bathurst decided to relax the conditions he had previously described as essential. The regulation that Napoleon had to show himself twice a day to the orderly officer had never been enforced anyway, as the emperor threatened to shoot on sight anyone invading his privacy. Now Bathurst formally waived it and even suggested that if Napoleon was prepared to show himself twice a day, he might have the freedom of the island. But by this time Napoleon's health was such that he no longer had any interest in roaming the not extensive length and breadth of the island. Besides, he was still engaged in a battle of wills where he refused to compromise. This was the context in which yet another physician made his appearance at Longwood. In accordance with the new post-1818 relaxed policy towards General Bonaparte, it was agreed that his household could be expanded. Madame Mere set about finding reliable servants who could be sent out to St. Helena, but in the meantime Napoleon was without a personal physician for 6 months. Only when his old symptoms returned at the beginning of 1819 did he allow Bertrand to go to Hudson Lowe and engage the naval surgeon Dr. John Stocko, who had come out with Admiral Plampin in 1817. Plampin proved more biddable by Lowe than his predecessors, as he gave hostages to fortune in a singularly inept way. Contrary to Admiralty regulations, Plampin had brought with him a young woman not his wife. This placed him at Low's mercy, for if he did not toe the governor's line he was likely to be recalled at once. Stocko went out to Longwood and treated Napoleon for 6 days. Napoleon made him swear he would not report on the medical condition of his patient to Hudson Lowe. Stocko agreed, but promptly issued 3 bulletins. These, however, enraged Lowe as they confirmed O'Meara's diagnosis of hepatitis. The implication was that Napoleon would recover if removed from the debilitating climate of St. Helena. Stocko was yet another who fell under the emperor's spell, and felt well enough disposed towards him to tell him that people with his symptoms often lived to the proverbial old age. In the tropics as well, Napoleon prompted. Stocko shook his head. Then Napoleon exclaimed angrily, "I would live to be 80 if I had not been brought to this damned island."